Beneath the golden sands of Egypt lies not just history, but a mirror of the human psyche, both luminous and terrifying. For thousands of years, we've stared at the pyramids, the hieroglyphs, the colossal statues with hollow eyes, and asked ourselves, what did they know that we don't? The truth is, ancient Egypt was never just a civilization. It was a contradiction, a paradox, a world where life was obsessed with death, where gods were both animal and divine, where kings became gods, but were still buried like men. This isn't just a story of tombs and treasures. It's a story of ideas so powerful they twisted reality. Myths that weren't just believed but lived. Rituals that weren't symbolic but said to reshape the cosmos. And buried in the forgotten corners of this civilization are truths that refuse to die. Truths that challenge our understanding of time, consciousness, and existence itself. In the next 2 hours, we'll unearth 25 paradoxes from ancient Egypt, each one a crack in the facade of what we think we know, not just about Egypt, but about ourselves. Because what if the real secret buried in the desert wasn't gold, but knowledge? Knowledge too dangerous to ever be spoken plainly. In the world of ancient Egypt, to name something was not merely to label it, it was to bring it into being. Words weren't symbols, they were forces, and names above all held the power to create gods. Take the story of the god Ptah. According to one of Egypt's most profound theological texts, the Memphite theology, Ptah didn't craft the world with his hands. He spoke it. He imagined it in his heart and spoke its name into existence. Mountains, rivers, plants, creatures, even other gods, each emerged as Ptah named them. Thought first, speech second, reality third. This was not metaphor. To the ancient Egyptians, it was literal. A god was only real after it had been named. Here lies the paradox. If a god must be named to exist, who or what named the first god? If the divine needs a name to become real, then how did the nameless become named? This isn't just a philosophical loop. It was embedded into Egyptian ritual and language. The act of naming a deity was sacred. It wasn't just prayer. It was creation. And the reverse was feared deeply. To erase a god's name was to erase the god. To carve out a name from temple walls was more than defacement. It was annihilation. This belief extended to human souls too. A person died a second death when their name was forgotten. That's why pharaohs covered their tombs with their names, and why enemies were damned by having their names chiseled out, a literal undoing of their spiritual self. It's no coincidence that many of Egypt's most powerful deities, Ra, Isis, Osiris, have names that echo power in their very sound. When Isis sought to control Ra, she didn't need weapons or armies. She only needed his secret name. And once she had it, Ra's authority passed to her. Even gods could be controlled by the right name, and even chaos could be banished if it could be spoken. So here is the haunting paradox. Egypt's gods may have been eternal, powerful, and divine, but they were also dependent on words, on human voices, on the continuity of memory. No name meant no presence, and in that dependency, they became fragile, mortal. Now look deeper. Doesn't this mirror something inside us? How much of your own identity is made of names? Your name, the labels given to you, the words others use to describe you, the ones you fight to earn, and the ones you wish to escape. If someone forgot your name, your story, how much of you would remain? The ancient Egyptians feared that loss deeply, but they also weaponized it. Priests could protect or destroy with a single word. Names were hidden in amulets, whispered in tombs, buried with the dead to anchor them in eternity. Because to name was to preserve, to speak was to continue. Silence was oblivion. So the next time you say your name, or someone else's, ask yourself, are you simply identifying something, or are you creating it? Is your name something you carry, or something that carries you? Because in Egypt, the gods did not name humans. Humans named the gods. And that is the kind of power no civilization should have. Yet somehow they did. The sands of Egypt have long since buried its kings, but one paradox has refused to be forgotten. The idea of a pharaoh who outlived time. Not by surviving death, but by never truly existing within time at all. In ancient Egyptian thought, the pharaoh was not just a man. He was Horus in life, Osiris in death, and Ra in eternity. His identity was split across divine roles that defied linear time. He wasn't seen as a mortal king moving through history. He was history, past and future, collapsed into a single body. Every pharaoh inherited not just the throne, but the title, Nesubit, son of Ra, as though each new ruler was merely a reawakening of the same divine being. It wasn't reincarnation, it was continuity. One pharaoh, many bodies, the same sun god, wearing different skins across millennia. Here's the paradox. If each pharaoh is the same soul in different vessels, then time itself becomes meaningless. There is no true beginning, no true end, only eternal return. And if that's true, was there ever a first pharaoh? Or has the pharaoh always existed outside of time, simply changing form to remain visible to human eyes? The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Some rulers, like Akhenaten, were so radically different that historians struggle to place them in the same timeline as others. His god was one, the Aten, a solar disk. No statues, no anthropomorphic deities, just light. Some call him the world's first monotheist, others call him a heretic. But maybe he wasn't defying time. Maybe he understood it differently. Then there's the enigma of Osiris, the god of the dead and first pharaoh. But he too died and rose again. Every pharaoh who died was thought to become Osiris. So who was the real pharaoh? The one who ruled? The one who died? The one who came back? And if death was merely transformation, then maybe time wasn't something to be feared. It was just a costume change, a ritual shedding of form. Pharaohs weren't bound by time. They wielded it. But this paradox didn't just belong to the divine. The Egyptians built their monuments to reflect this belief. The pyramids, massive beyond reason, weren't just tombs. They were clocks of stone, locked in perfect celestial alignment with stars that hadn't shifted in tens of thousands of years. Time for them wasn't linear. It was a cycle, a loop, and within that loop, the pharaoh remained, forever. Even the art shows this. Pharaohs are never shown aging. They appear timeless in every depiction, frozen in the prime of life, godlike and unchanging. No wrinkles, no decay, just divine permanence. Because to show age would be to admit that time could touch them, and it couldn't. Not really. So what does it mean for a human to step outside of time? To be born not into history, but above it. The pharaoh was worshipped not because he ruled people, but because he ruled the calendar, the seasons, the resurrection of the sun each morning. He didn't serve time. Time served him. But even in modern times, we still chase this same paradox. The rich preserve themselves in cryogenic chambers. Leaders try to immortalize their names in history books. Digital avatars promise eternal presence, but the ancient Egyptians had already done it, with stone, story, and symbol. The Pharaoh didn't fear time. He outlived it. And in some strange way, maybe he still does. There's something unsettling about the tombs of ancient Egypt. Something that goes far beyond the sarcophagi, the golden masks, or the curses carved into stone. It's the feeling that some of these structures knew who was coming long before the person they were meant for was even born. This is the paradox of the tomb that was built before its builder. Take the Valley of the Kings, for example. Dozens of tombs carved deep into the mountains, prepared with eerie precision. Corridors, traps, spells, and inscriptions waiting patiently in the dark. Sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. Some were finished before the pharaohs' reign had even begun. Why? Because the tomb wasn't an afterthought. It was a precondition. The pharaoh's divinity was only complete when his resting place was ready. In essence, the tomb didn't honor his life. It defined it. He was born to be entombed. Now consider this. Some tombs were constructed for rulers who never used them. Others were mysteriously repurposed, reassigned, or sealed off. In several cases, we find tombs so elaborate and early in construction that it feels as if death had been anticipated before life began. It wasn't build it when he dies. It was build it so that he can live. This flips our understanding. In modern thinking, we live, we act, we die, and we are buried. But in ancient Egypt, the tomb was the starting point of a pharaoh's immortality. It was the gateway to the afterlife, the structure that enabled him to transform into a god. Without the tomb, the pharaoh's soul couldn't ascend. He would be trapped, forgotten, mortal. This gave tombs an eerie prophetic quality. Their architecture anticipated rituals, myths, and spiritual journeys that hadn't yet occurred. They were like cosmic scripts waiting for their main character to arrive. And this leads to the deeper paradox. If the tomb was the script, did the pharaoh live according to it? Was his life shaped around what had already been carved in stone? Imagine being born and knowing that your final destination was already sealed, that somewhere in the desert, your future was being dug from rock, step by step, silently preparing for your body. Wouldn't that bend your sense of free will? Some scholars believe that this may have even influenced political actions. If a pharaoh's tomb was interrupted, looted, or cursed before he died, it could send spiritual shockwaves across the kingdom. In a way, the tomb's integrity protected history itself, and it wasn't just kings. Nobles, priests, and high officials often had tombs designed with symbolic events that hadn't yet happened. Scenes of offerings, relationships, and spiritual victories that were forecasted rather than remembered. So here's the question. Was the tomb a memory of a life, or the blueprint for one? The Egyptians may have believed that to truly live forever, you had to reverse the order. Build the end first, then live your life to fulfill it. The tomb, then, wasn't a prison. It was a cosmic anchor. It kept the soul oriented in eternity. Modern culture sees death as the end. They saw it as the beginning of what truly mattered. And maybe that's why their monuments still stand while empires crumble. because they planned for death before they even lived. There's a reason we whisper when we speak of Egyptian curses. Even today, thousands of years later, the idea still sends chills through the bones of those who dare to disturb ancient tombs. But these curses weren't just superstitions carved into stone. They were defenses, not of gold or relics, but of truth itself. This is the paradox. The curse did not simply guard the tomb. It guarded something deeper, something that couldn't be touched or stolen. Knowledge, forbidden knowledge, sacred truth that had to remain buried. We often think of curses as threats. Whoever opens this tomb shall suffer. But in Egypt, curses weren't passive warnings. They were activated forces, spoken spells, ritual words that aligned divine power with cosmic justice. If you violated the tomb, you weren't just breaking a seal, you were breaking the order of the universe, and the universe would respond. So why guard these tombs so fiercely? Were they merely trying to keep out grave robbers? Perhaps, but many curses weren't placed near treasures. They were found near texts, near ritual inscriptions, near depictions of gods interacting with the soul. In other words, the deeper the spiritual truth, the stronger the curse. There's one particular case that still baffles historians. The tomb of the high priest Herihor. His burial texts weren't just protective. They encrypted complex theological ideas that reinterpreted the relationship between gods and humans. But scholars have noted something's missing. Gaps, hidden layers. Almost as if parts of his message were intentionally sealed off, not for preservation but for protection. Protection from us. That's the paradox. The truth was sacred, but also dangerous. It needed to be remembered, yet hidden, preserved, but not exposed. So the Egyptians used the only tool powerful enough to keep people away: fear. Even the famous Curse of the Pharaoh surrounding Tutankhamun's tomb has layers we've overlooked. After Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, a series of mysterious deaths among those involved sparked public panic. Scientists later blamed mold, bacteria, or coincidence. But the ancient Egyptians wouldn't have seen these deaths as random. They would have said the tomb was protected, not just by a spell, but by the will of the gods. The real twist is that many of these curses weren't only about punishment. Some were ethical riddles. Let the one who enters with pure heart be untouched. Let the greedy suffer. In this way, the curse wasn't a universal sentence. It was a test, a moral filter. If your intention was pure, you might pass. If not, the consequences would follow you. It's as if the Egyptians knew that the greatest truths could not be handed to just anyone. Power, cosmic, divine, and dangerous, had to be locked away behind fear, and maybe they were right. Think about it. When modern archaeologists unseal a tomb, they don't just uncover artifacts, they disrupt contexts. They break the continuity of silence. And sometimes, they find things that don't fit the expected timeline, unfinished texts, unknown deities, rituals not recorded elsewhere, secrets that shake our understanding of Egyptian theology. What if some of those secrets weren't lost, but hidden on purpose? Some researchers now speculate that certain tombs were designed with intentional misdirection. False corridors, symbolic dead ends, even traps that would physically or spiritually mislead the intruder. Not to protect wealth, but to delay or confuse anyone trying to access sacred teachings. It makes you wonder, was the curse ever about keeping people out? Or was it about keeping something in? That is the heart of this paradox. A curse that protects a truth so powerful that even knowledge becomes dangerous. A wisdom so immense it needed guardianship not by sword, but by fear itself. We live in an age where everything is meant to be discovered, decoded, understood. But the ancient Egyptians lived in a world where some truths were not meant to be touched. They didn't fear ignorance. They feared what would happen if the wrong person understood too much. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. To speak in ancient Egypt was never a casual act. Every syllable, every glyph etched into stone, every whisper in a temple carried weight, not just metaphorical, but cosmic. This was a civilization that believed words didn't describe reality, they shaped it. A belief system where language was not merely communication, but creation. This brings us to the paradox. In Egypt, the spoken word could command existence, yet once spoken, it could never be taken back. Reality itself was obedient to language, but language was irreversible. What was uttered became real, whether one meant it or not. The Egyptian term for magical speech was hekau, words of power. They weren't symbolic spells like fairy tales suggest. These were performative utterances. Saying them was doing them. If a priest spoke a healing formula, healing began. If a curse was recited, the target was already unraveling. And if a name was invoked, the presence of that entity was summoned. Take the opening of the mouth ritual, a funerary ceremony performed on the deceased. Priests would recite precise words over the mummy, believing the spoken formula would literally reawaken the senses in the afterlife. Without these spoken commands, the dead remained blind, mute, and still. Words were the gatekeepers to resurrection. This linguistic magic extended to hieroglyphs as well. Hieroglyphs weren't letters or pictures, they were living beings. A carved snake hieroglyph could, in theory, become an actual snake, unless it was intentionally disarmed. That's why you'll often see a line drawn through dangerous hieroglyphs in tombs. It wasn't vandalism, it was containment. The paradox intensifies when we consider Egypt's creation myths. The god Ptah, as explored earlier, created the world not through labor, but through speech. He conceived the world in thought, then spoke it into being. The Nile, the sun, the gods themselves, all spoken into reality like sentences in a divine book. And yet for all this power, speech was a double-edged blade. A misspoken word could cause spiritual harm. A single incorrect pronunciation during ritual could spoil an entire ceremony. That's why priests trained for decades, because every word carried cosmic consequences. But here's where the paradox truly disturbs. If language shaped reality, then those who controlled language controlled the world. And in Egypt, that meant the priesthood, the scribes, the few who could read and write the sacred script. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was dangerous. Only the initiated were allowed to access certain texts, and many spells were kept hidden in temple vaults, sealed with curses to prevent misuse. Some texts describe how certain divine names, true names, were too dangerous to be written at all. The goddess Isis, in one myth, manipulates the god Ra by extracting his secret name. Once she has it, she gains divine authority over him. His power becomes hers, not through battle, but through language, through knowledge of the correct word. So what happens when reality bends to words and words fall into the wrong mouths? That's the nightmare behind this paradox. If someone were to learn the forbidden names, the wrong formulas, the sacred phonemes left behind in temple ruins, could they still work? Could ancient language still command modern reality? Some Egyptologists argue no, but others remain cautious. They've seen how precise the Egyptians were with ritual structure, alignment, and intonation. It wasn't just belief, it was engineering. And like any technology, it only needs the right user. Modern science may scoff at this, but consider, even today, words change reality. A judge says guilty, and a life changes. A politician says war, and nations move. A prayer, a slur, a promise. Our world still trembles under the weight of language. The Egyptians just made that truth divine. So the next time you speak, especially in anger or fear or love, remember, in ancient Egypt, every word was a spell and every speaker a sorcerer. And in a way, that hasn't changed. We still build and destroy worlds with nothing but our tongues. We often see pyramids as symbols of the past, solid, immovable, ancient reminders of human ambition. But to the ancient Egyptians, the pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a mirror that didn't reflect the earth below, but the sky above. This is the paradox. The pyramid, though firmly grounded in the desert sand, was designed to imitate and communicate with the stars. A monument of stone built to reflect the heavens. A structure of weight meant to defy gravity's symbolism and become divine. At the heart of this paradox is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its proportions are too precise, its alignments too perfect, to dismiss as coincidence. Each side of the base aligns almost exactly with true north, south, east, and west. The shafts inside the pyramid, long, narrow passages carved into the stone, point directly to certain constellations, like Orion's, Belt and Sirius. These weren't random stars, they were gods. Orion represented Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Sirius was associated with Isis, goddess of resurrection. The belief was simple, yet profound. When a pharaoh died, his soul would ascend through these celestial pathways, reuniting with the divine stars that ruled the afterlife. The pyramid was not just a resting place, it was a launch pad for the soul, and here's where it becomes stranger. The layout of the three main pyramids on the Giza Plateau reflects the alignment of Orion's belt. Not just roughly, but with eerie precision. 3 stars, 3 pyramids, a heavenly map built on Earth. But why? Because the Egyptians believed the sky was not just above them, it was within them. The divine realm wasn't distant, it overlapped with the human world through geometry, architecture, and ritual. To build a pyramid wasn't to raise stone, but to raise a reflection. Earth echoing sky. This concept, known as above, so below, permeated Egyptian spiritual thought. Temples were mirrors of the heavens. Rituals mimicked celestial events. Even the Nile, winding through the landscape, was said to mirror the Milky Way above. The entire civilization was a copy of something divine, and pyramids were its sharpest expression. But here's the real twist. The pyramid didn't only reflect the sky, it also tried to control it. By aligning with stars that rose and set on specific dates, priests could track solstices, equinoxes, and the annual flooding of the Nile, events crucial to Egypt's survival. In this way, the pyramid became a cosmic tool, a calendar, a divine machine of measurement. So the paradox deepens. A structure that appears still, dead, and eternal was once dynamic, alive, and moving with the stars. We think of pyramids as frozen in time, but they were built to follow time, to chase it, catch it, understand it. Even more unsettling is the fact that no one truly knows how these pyramids were built. The precision, the size, the logistics, it all seems to exceed what should have been possible for the technology of the time. Some theories suggest lost knowledge, others divine inspiration. But maybe the answer is simpler. They didn't build to imitate the gods. They built as if they were gods. And what does that say about us? Today, we build taller buildings, faster, machines. But we've stopped aligning them with the stars. We no longer try to mirror the heavens. We try to escape them. The Egyptians didn't want to flee the sky. They wanted to become one with it. Their pyramids weren't meant to last forever as monuments, but as messages to the universe. We were here, and we remembered the stars. So the next time you see the sharp silhouette of a pyramid, ask yourself, is it pointing upward for the dead, or downward from the sky? In most cultures, death is the great ending, a curtain pulled tight over the stage of life. But in ancient Egypt, death was not an end, it was a door, and paradoxically, one had to die in order to live forever. This is the paradox of death that brought immortality, a civilization that worshipped life to its fullest, spent its greatest efforts preparing for its end. But in their eyes, death wasn't a defeat, it was a transition, a necessary passage from a fleeting human existence into a realm of eternal becoming. The Egyptians had a word for this eternal life, jet, an unchanging, everlasting state. But to reach it, one had to navigate duat, the treacherous underworld. And this journey wasn't symbolic. It was detailed, mapped out in sacred texts like the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates. These weren't myths. They were manuals, instruction guides for the soul. To the living, death was preparation. The entire life of a noble, a priest, or a pharaoh was structured around ensuring their soul could survive the passage beyond. Rituals were performed, spells memorized. The body was preserved, not just for honor, but as a vessel, a tool the soul would need again. Here lies the paradox in its rawest form. To achieve eternal life, one had to first simulate death in rituals, in art, in daily practice. Death wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you rehearsed for. In this way, Egyptians became the most meticulous students of mortality the world has ever known. The mummification process itself reflected this belief. It wasn't just physical preservation. Every organ had symbolic meaning. The heart was left inside to be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of Ma'at, truth. If the heart was lighter, the soul passed on. If not, it was devoured by the monstrous Amit. But here's the twist. Your actions in life determined your soul's weight. Morality wasn't abstract, it was gravitational. So death judged the living, but it also rewarded them. The just were promised fields of reeds, Aru, an idealized reflection of earthly life, where crops grew without toil, where family remained whole, where time had no edge. Paradise, but it could only be accessed through death. There was no shortcut, and yet despite their obsession with death, the Egyptians celebrated life. They drank wine, danced, adorned themselves with color and perfume, because they believed life was a test, a sacred opportunity to prepare the soul. To die unready was a tragedy. To die prepared was triumph. Even pharaohs, who were considered divine, were not exempt. They had to earn their place in the afterlife. That's why tombs were filled not just with treasures, but with tools. Boats to navigate the underworld, food for the journey, Shabti figurines to perform labor on their behalf. The afterlife wasn't just a dream. It was a continuation of existence, structured, demanding, real. But the paradox reaches deeper still. In some cases, a person's true identity wasn't realized until after death. Only through proper burial, naming, and ritual could the deceased become a complete version of themselves, a concept known as Ak. Life was the shadow. Death was the full emergence. This reverses modern thinking. To us, life is where we build meaning. To them, death was where meaning was revealed. And perhaps that's what haunts us most about the Egyptian view, that we may only truly know ourselves when we are no longer here, that life is a rehearsal, a mask, a preparation for a deeper self that cannot awaken until the body falls away. So they welcome death, not eagerly, but respectfully. They didn't fear the end. They trained for it, because in Egypt, to die wasn't to disappear, it was to become. Among the many haunting beliefs of ancient Egypt, few are as strange or as unsettling as the idea that your soul could be weighed, not judged by deeds alone, not evaluated by emotion or faith, but literally balanced on a scale, and not against gold or guilt, but against a single feather. This is the paradox of the mirror that showed the soul's weight, a civilization that believed the most invisible part of you, your moral essence, could be revealed, measured, and reflected back with absolute clarity. In the Hall of Two Truths, the soul would stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, while Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of the underworld, placed the heart of the deceased on one side of a golden scale. On the other side, the feather of Mayat, goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. If your heart weighed the same or less, your soul was pure. You were free to enter the field of reeds, Egypt's paradise. But if your heart was heavier, burdened by lies, cruelty, or injustice, it was devoured by Amit, a monstrous creature. Part lion, part hippo, part crocodile. This judgment wasn't metaphorical. The Egyptians believed it would literally happen. They prepared for it with spells, rituals, confessions, and moral declarations known as the negative confessions, a list of sins they didn't commit. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not dishonored my parents. These statements weren't boasts. They were shields, words that could protect the soul during its final reflection. And here's where the paradox deepens. The heart, the most personal and emotional organ, was also the most objective. You couldn't lie to the scale. You couldn't argue with it. The judgment wasn't based on appearances, intentions, or regret. It was truth incarnate, reflected with unflinching precision. This is where the metaphor of the mirror becomes powerful. The scale wasn't just a tool, it was a reflection, not of how you saw yourself, but how the universe saw you. And in that moment, you saw it too. Your entire life, its weight, its worth, made visible. But here lies the paradox. If your own heart betrays you, do you even deserve to move on? If the part of you that kept you alive is too heavy to pass, then it becomes the very thing that destroys you. This belief drove how Egyptians lived. It wasn't enough to obey laws or follow rituals. You had to align with Ma'at, not just the goddess, but the principle she represented: balance, harmony, truth. Even kings were expected to uphold Ma'at, or risk destabilizing the world itself. This belief kept both peasants and pharaohs accountable, not just to their people, but to the universe. And yet, the judgment was not without compassion. The soul was often accompanied by Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, who recorded the trial with neutrality. He was not judge or executioner, he was the one who remembered. The Egyptians believed truth required not just balance, but witnessing. You were not judged in silence. You were seen. But consider what this means philosophically. What if your life is always being weighed? Not after death, but now. What if every choice adds weight or lifts it? What if morality isn't measured in intention, but in impact? Would your heart grow lighter with kindness, heavier with silence? And if such a mirror existed today, one that showed not your face, but your soul's weight, would you dare look? The Egyptians didn't just dare. They built their entire worldview around that question. So the next time you wonder what kind of person you are, imagine standing in front of the mirror that reveals everything, not your body, but your being, and ask yourself, would your soul float like a feather or sink with secrets? Among the many divine symbols of ancient Egypt, none is as enigmatic or as all-seeing as the Eye of Horus. Painted on tombs, worn as amulets, and carved into stone, this eye was not simply a symbol of protection or healing. It was something deeper, something older, something watching. This is the paradox of the eye that watched the future, a gaze rooted in the past, yet fixed upon what has not yet occurred, a symbol from antiquity that was believed to pierce through time itself. To understand this paradox, we must return to the myth of Horus and Set. Horus, god of kingship and the sky, battled Set, the chaotic force of violence and disorder, to avenge the death of his father, Osiris. During their struggle, Horus's eye was torn out. Later, it was restored by the god Thoth, making it whole again, but forever changed. No longer just an eye, it became a tool of cosmic perception, a symbol of restoration, clarity, and divine vision. But the restored eye of Horus didn't just see the present, it was believed to see what would be. The Egyptians used it in rituals not just to protect from evil, but to foresee outcomes. It was painted on ships to guide them safely, buried with the dead to help them navigate the afterlife, carved into temple entrances to detect evil before it entered. Here's where the paradox emerges. How can something rooted in myth and symbol act as a conscious observer of events that haven't yet unfolded? How can a carved image or a spoken invocation interact with a future that hasn't happened? In the Egyptian worldview, time was not linear. It was cyclical. The future wasn't an unknown void. It was a pattern, one that echoed eternally. Just as the sun rose each morning and the Nile flooded each year, so too would the soul face judgment. The gods battle chaos, and life spiral forward in predictable loops. The Eye of Horus didn't predict the future like an oracle. It recognized it because it had seen it before. But there's another layer. The eye was also a system of measurement. Each part of the eye corresponded to a fraction, and together they made up a near-complete whole. 6364. That missing 164 was not an error. It was intentional, a symbol of the unknowable, the unseen sliver of the future that even divine vision could not capture fully. So the paradox becomes sharper. The eye can see the future, but not all of it. It offers near-complete understanding, but not perfection. A future visible, but never fully knowable. In this way, the Egyptians embraced the tension between knowledge and mystery. They believed one could prepare for the future, not by controlling it, but by harmonizing with the patterns of existence. The Eye of Horus was their compass, not one that pointed north, but one that pointed forward through eternity. And today, that idea still lingers. We place eyes on machines, on surveillance cameras, on satellites orbiting the Earth, always watching, always searching for what comes next. But like the Eye of Horus, we too cannot see the final fraction. No algorithm, no calculation, no prophecy can show us the whole picture. So the next time you see an eye carved in stone, painted in blue and gold, know that it's not watching you out of memory. It's watching what you might become. A reminder that the future is not a blank page. It's a scroll that has been written, erased, and rewritten, again and again. Because the eye doesn't just protect, it waits, it watches, and sometimes it warns. We often think of reading as a passive act, a person absorbing knowledge from ink on a page. But in ancient Egypt, to read certain texts was to change, not just to learn, but to be transformed by the act itself. Some scrolls didn't simply tell stories or give instructions. They reshaped the soul of whoever dared to read them. This is the paradox of the scroll that wrote its reader. Sacred texts that didn't just inform, but interacted. Texts that didn't end when you closed them, because they continued inside of you. In Egyptian culture, scrolls weren't casual documents. They were sacred vessels, containers of divine breath. The Book of the Dead, for example, wasn't a book in the modern sense. It was a personalized map for the soul, written in papyrus scrolls and buried with the dead. Its real title was the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a manual to rise from death into eternal life. But here's where it becomes uncanny. These texts didn't just tell the soul what to do, they prepared it to become something else. To read the scroll was to rehearse your afterlife, to become familiar with gods you hadn't yet met, to memorize spells that would open doors you hadn't reached. In that way, the scroll was not recording your life. It was writing it in advance. Even more strange were the texts only priests could read. Some magical papyri were said to contain instructions that, if spoken aloud, could call down divine forces or change reality itself. These scrolls were not meant for all eyes. Their very words were considered too powerful, too active, for casual reading. To encounter such a scroll wasn't like reading a book. It was like standing in a conversation with the cosmos. You didn't just learn from it. You were judged by how you received it. It knew what you were ready for, or not. The paradox intensifies when you consider that many of these scrolls were written not in plain language, but in layers, literal, symbolic, and mystical. A single line might mean one thing to a novice and something entirely different to a trained initiate. It wasn't just about translation, it was about who you were when you read it. In that sense, the scroll was waiting for you to become the right version of yourself before it revealed its deeper meaning. So who is writing whom? If you begin reading a scroll that was written to prepare your soul, and that scroll contains thoughts, prayers, names, and rituals that alter how you see the world, then your future self is being co-authored by the text. You are not the only writer of your identity. The scroll joins in, and that's where it becomes disturbing. What if you can never unread what you've read? What if the moment you encounter divine knowledge, real or imagined, it rewrites you permanently? Not in your memory, but in your spirit. This is what Egyptian priests believed, that to handle sacred texts was to handle your own fate. That a name spoken aloud could imprint itself on your soul. That a misread spell could condemn you in the afterlife. And that a properly read one could save you. It's why some scrolls were buried in tombs, locked away from the living, not because they weren't valuable, but because they were too valuable. Knowledge, once known, could not be taken back. Even now, the scroll haunts us. We chase forbidden texts, hidden scriptures, ancient codes that promise truth. But truth doesn't just reveal, it rewrites. So before you read what is hidden, ask yourself, are you ready to become a character in a story not written by you? Because in ancient Egypt, sometimes the scroll was reading you back. To modern minds, the sun is a star, a sphere of gas, burning with nuclear fire, following predictable patterns across the sky. But to the ancient Egyptians, the sun was something much stranger. It was a god, a traveler, a warrior, and most haunting of all, it was a corpse. This is the paradox of the sun that died every day to be reborn. A being of supreme power, light, and life that had to die in order to return. Not metaphorically, but literally. For the Egyptians, every sunset was a death, every sunrise a resurrection. The sun was known as Ra, the supreme solar deity. During the day, Ra sailed across the sky in his solar boat, illuminating the world and sustaining life. But when he reached the western horizon, he did not vanish into sleep. He descended into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. There, he faced the most terrifying ordeal in the cosmos, a nightly journey through darkness, chaos, and death. Each night, Ra battled the serpent Apep, the embodiment of disorder and non-existence. If Ra failed, the sun would not rise again. The world would fall into eternal night. But he always succeeded, always rose again, reborn with the dawn, and yet even Ra, immortal, divine, had to die every single day. Here's the paradox. How can a being be eternal if it must continually perish? How can resurrection be true immortality if it's required on a daily cycle? The Egyptians embraced this contradiction. To them, immortality wasn't static. It was active. You didn't live forever by staying the same. You lived forever by continually overcoming death. Permanence was not about being untouched. It was about being reformed again and again. This belief shaped not only their theology, but their architecture, their rituals, and even their calendars. Temples were built to capture solar light at specific moments of the year, recreating the cycle of Ra's death and rebirth. Priests performed daily rituals at dawn and dusk, reenacting Ra's descent and return. And pharaohs, believed to be manifestations of Ra on earth, modeled their lives and deaths on this solar journey. But there was more. During Ra's nightly voyage through the Duat, he didn't just fight demons. He visited the dead. He met with Osiris, god of the underworld. He merged with him, and for that brief moment in the deepest part of night, Ra was both the god of life and the god of death. Light and darkness fused into one. This merging carried deep symbolic meaning. It suggested that even the most powerful light must embrace its opposite to remain whole. That in order to sustain the world, the sun must die. Without that death, there is no sunrise. We see echoes of this paradox in modern life. The idea that rest, retreat, even suffering are necessary for growth. That light without shadow is incomplete. That to truly live, one must allow part of oneself to die. Habits, beliefs, even identities. The Egyptians weren't afraid of this. They found it sacred. They ritualized it. And perhaps most eerily, they saw this solar death not just as a celestial event, but as a personal one. Just as the sun sank into the duat, so too would the human soul descend into its own underworld. The same obstacles, the same threats, the same hope for return. To prepare for death, then, was not to retreat. It was to align yourself with Ra, to become one who, like the sun, could rise again. So the next time you watch the sunset, ask yourself, are you witnessing an ending or a promise? Because in Egypt, every death was a preparation for the light to come. And the sun, though divine, still had to pass through darkness to prove it was worthy to rise. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, few deities are as quietly haunting as Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, funerary rites, and the weighing of souls. He appears in countless tombs and scrolls, silent and watchful, guiding the dead through the darkest journey of all. But beneath his calm and sacred role lies a chilling contradiction. This is the paradox of Anubis, who judged himself. The god responsible for measuring the moral weight of every soul must, by the logic of eternity, also confront the weight of his own. The one who watches all must eventually be watched. Anubis plays a key role in the ceremony of the weighing of the heart. In this solemn ritual, the deceased stands before Osiris and the 42 judges of Maat, while Anubis weighs their heart against the feather of truth. It is Anubis who decides if the soul is light enough to pass, or heavy enough to be devoured by Amit, the soul eater. But here lies the dilemma. Anubis is not just the facilitator. He is also a god of death, preservation, and judgment. And judgment, by nature, is moral. So who judges the judge? Can a god charged with guiding others to truth be free of self-examination? This question takes on new meaning when we look at Anubis's origins. He is the child of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived in secrecy, hidden by shame. In some myths, Nephthys disguises herself as her sister Isis to seduce Osiris, resulting in Anubis's birth. He is born of deception, even as he becomes the enforcer of divine order. That contradiction never disappears. Anubis, born of shadows, becomes the guardian of light. He masks his own origin while revealing the deepest truths of others. He is both outsider and gatekeeper, and thus we are left with a cosmic paradox. Can one born of concealment be the agent of ultimate transparency? The Egyptians likely felt this tension too. In later periods, Anubis was slowly replaced in some traditions by Osiris, who took on greater authority over the afterlife. Was this theological evolution, or judgment rendered upon the judge himself? Perhaps Anubis knew that to lead others into truth, one must confront their own. And perhaps this is why he appears so quiet, so still. He is not arrogant like Set, not radiant like Ra. He is always watching, always measuring. Perhaps because he too is being measured. There's something deeply human in that idea, that even the ones who guide us, our teachers, our leaders, our moral anchors, must eventually sit in the same seat of judgment. That no amount of wisdom exempts anyone from being known completely. This paradox also reflects the Egyptian belief in Ma'at, cosmic balance. No role, no power, no God exists outside that law. Even the divine must bow to truth. Even Anubis must pass through the weighing. And so we are left with an image both beautiful and unsettling. The God of judgment, one day standing before his own scale, heart in hand, feather beside it, alone, measured by the same laws he upheld for others. Would his heart be light, or would the burden of centuries, the secrets kept, the sins unspoken, drag it down? In a world built on ritual and cosmic order, the Egyptians didn't fear perfection. They feared imbalance. And perhaps they knew that justice was only real if everyone, even the gods, were held to the same eternal law. So the next time you imagine Anubis standing over a soul, scales in hand, ask yourself, what does he see when he looks inward? Because even the one who weighs hearts must someday weigh his own. To most people, the afterlife begins where life ends. A final breath, a closing moment, a step into the unknown. But to the ancient Egyptians, that line was blurred. To them, death was not a beginning. It was a continuation. And for those who truly understood the universe, the afterlife had already begun long before the body died. This is the paradox of the afterlife that began before death. A civilization that treated life as though it were already part of the realm beyond. A belief system where preparing for eternity wasn't something you did at the end, but something you lived every single day. The Egyptians had a word for this eternal journey. Jet, meaning time that is unchanging, eternal, fixed. But to reach Jet, one had to pass through Nehe, the cyclical, earthly time. This meant that the world of the living wasn't separate from the world of the dead. It was simply the first chapter in a much larger story. Their architecture reflected this. Temples were built as both places of worship and as symbolic gateways to the afterlife. Statues weren't just decorative, they were vessels for the ka, or spiritual essence. Even homes of the living often mimicked the symmetry of tombs. In some ways, the entire civilization was one great rehearsal for the world beyond. This paradox is most vividly seen in the lives of the pharaohs and priests. From childhood, a ruler was taught not just how to govern, but how to die, how to speak the correct words, how to recognize the gods, how to pass the trials of the duat. Their tombs were planned while they were still young, their sarcophagi carved, their scrolls written, their souls shaped while their bodies still breathed. The belief was not that you died and then prepared for judgment. The belief was that judgment had already begun through your choices, your rituals, your ability to live in harmony with Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth and balance. If you strayed from it in life, your soul was already becoming heavy. The heart you would someday place on the scale was already forming its weight. Even ordinary people participated in this living afterlife. They commissioned tombs, recited protective spells, placed amulets on children, not out of fear, but out of alignment. They wanted their lives to match the shape of what would come next, to be ready, not just morally, but cosmically. The result was a society where death wasn't taboo. It was integrated, celebrated, managed. Death was not feared, but navigated. A destination as familiar as home. But here's where the paradox cuts deeper. If the afterlife begins before death, then are we already dead in some sense? Or are we simply in a stage of transformation, already shedding our temporary identities, already writing the next chapter? To the Egyptians, this wasn't a morbid thought. It was liberating. It meant that life had more meaning, not less. That every action was part of your eternal story. That death wasn't the opposite of life. It was its mirror. And maybe that's why their monuments still stand. Their names still echo. Their rituals still whisper through time. Because they didn't wait for the end to begin living forever. They started while they were alive. So ask yourself, if the afterlife is already in motion, what have you done today that you will carry into eternity? Because in ancient Egypt, the soul's journey didn't start at death. It started the moment you understood that life itself was already part of the beyond. Walk through the Egyptian desert today and you'll find only silence, winds shifting dunes, traces of stone temples half buried in time. It seems lifeless, hollow, forgotten. But the ancient Egyptians didn't see the desert as empty. They believed it was alive, watching, and above all, remembering. This is the paradox of the sand that remembered footsteps. A landscape made of shifting dust that somehow held memory. A place where what was lost could never truly be forgotten, and where every step left a mark, even if the wind erased it from view. To the Egyptians, the desert, known as the Deshret, was more than a harsh environment. It was a sacred and dangerous boundary between worlds. It was where souls traveled in death, where the sun, God Ra, entered the underworld each night, where forgotten gods dwelled, and where memory did not fade, it echoed. When someone walked across the desert to a tomb or left offerings in the sand, they weren't just performing a ritual. They were activating a memory. Every footprint was seen by the gods, every grain of sand a witness. Even if the marks were wiped away by the wind, the act itself was believed to remain recorded in the spirit of the land. This belief extended to burial practices. Many tombs were placed in the desert, not because of convenience, but because of sacred geography. The Western Desert, the direction of the setting sun, was associated with death and rebirth. Souls would pass through this liminal space on their way to the Duat, the underworld, and the sand beneath their resting place held the energy of all who had passed before. In this way, the desert became a memory field, a place that forgot nothing. The paradox deepens when we consider how fragile sand appears. It shifts constantly, it buries, it obscures, it erases, and yet the Egyptians saw it as the perfect medium for memory, not because it preserved physically, but because it remembered spiritually. You could not deceive the desert. What was done there remained. This idea wasn't just poetic, it was theological. The god Set, who murdered his brother Osiris, was exiled to the desert. His rage, violence, and exile gave the sand its jewel, nature, sacred yet hostile, still yet violent. Even in myth, the desert held the memory of sin. It didn't forgive easily, and yet it also became a place of revelation. Many sacred visions occurred in the desert. Prophecies, encounters with gods, divine dreams, all unfolded in the quiet, shifting stillness of sand. Because when the world is stripped away, what's left are the echoes. So the question arises, if we walk through life believing that nothing remembers, that time and decay erase all traces, what kind of people do we become? But if we believe, like the Egyptians, that the world itself remembers, that the land bears witness to our steps, then even the smallest action carries infinite weight. Perhaps that's why they built their temples with such care, aligned them with the stars, carved prayers into stone, not to defy time, but to cooperate with memory, to create a world where nothing good was ever lost, and nothing evil was ever truly gone. Today, archaeologists dig into the desert and uncover stories once thought vanished. Statues emerge, tombs reappear, names long buried are spoken again, as if the sand had simply been waiting. So the next time you step across dry ground, ask yourself, what does the earth beneath you remember? And what have you left behind, intentionally or not? Because in ancient Egypt, even the wind-swept dunes were storytellers, and the sand did more than swallow footsteps. It kept them. Statues in modern times are meant to preserve. They represent what once was, a frozen tribute to kings, warriors, or ideas. But in ancient Egypt, a statue wasn't a memorial. It was a container, a threshold between worlds. And some believed it could dream. This is the paradox of the statue that dreamed of life. An object carved from stone, unmoving and silent, yet believed to hold a conscious spirit, a piece of a soul capable of awareness, thought, and even longing. To understand this, we must explore the role of K statues. In Egyptian belief, the Ka was one of several parts of the soul, the life force, the double, the spiritual twin. After death, the Ka required sustenance to remain strong. Offerings of food, wine, incense, and ritual were provided not directly to the mummy, but to the statue. The stone figure wasn't symbolic, it was the living stand-in for the deceased. And here's where it gets surreal. The Egyptians believed that through proper rituals, the statue could be activated. The opening of the mouth ceremony allowed the Ka to enter the statue, granting it the ability to see, hear, and exist in the earthly realm once again. The stone figure wasn't just blessed, it was awakened. Now, imagine a statue buried deep in a tomb, sealed in darkness for centuries, yet alive in a spiritual sense, not moving, not speaking, but aware, a dormant witness to time, a vessel that once held a soul, still dreaming of light, sound, and movement. This wasn't just religious metaphor, it was existential architecture. Every wrinkle carved in a statue's face, every line of hieroglyphics inscribed at its base, was there to guide and inform the soul that might one day return to inhabit it again. The paradox becomes deeper when you consider how common these statues were. Pharaohs, priests, and even some commoners had Ka statues made, believing their souls would need these bodies in the afterlife. Many tombs contained not one statue, but dozens, different postures, different expressions, as if offering the soul choices, forms to try on, like costumes for the next world. But what happens if the ritual is never performed? If the statue is buried, forgotten, desecrated? Does it still wait? Does it still dream? One haunting example is the Great Sphinx. Towering and weathered, older than the pyramids, it has no inscriptions between its paws, no clear records of its origin. Some believe it was meant to be a living god, awake under the sun. Others say it was abandoned mid-ritual, its spirit never fully awakened. A sleeping deity with eyes wide open, locked in an eternal, unfulfilled dream. We see echoes of this paradox in our own world, in myths of golems, automatons, AIs that gain awareness, in stories of statues that weep or bleed. We are fascinated by the moment when the inanimate almost becomes animate. The boundary between object and being begins to blur. But the Egyptians believed this was not fiction. It was reality. Not every statue came to life, but every statue could, if honored correctly, if activated with precision, if remembered. So what if a statue is dreaming, and what does it dream of? Does it imagine breath? The warmth of sun on stone skin? The return of the priest who once called its name? Or does it dream of being seen again? Because in Egypt, to be seen was to be remembered. To be remembered was to be real. And to be real was to live. Again, the Nile River is more than just a geographical feature. It is the spine of Egypt's civilization, the giver of life, the carrier of silt, the source of sustenance for one of the world's oldest and most enduring cultures. But the Nile was never just a river to the Egyptians. It was a being, a cycle, a paradox. This is the paradox of the river that flowed both ways. A current that moved in one direction physically, yet symbolically, spiritually, and ritually reversed itself, depending on how you viewed time, death, and the journey of the soul. On the surface, the Nile flows predictably, from south to north, from the highlands of East Africa to the delta that spills into the Mediterranean Sea. This made Egypt unusual. Most great rivers like the Tigris or the Euphrates flow from north to south, but the Nile's reversal created a strange dissonance between how the land moved and how the heavens were perceived. For the ancient Egyptians, south was upstream, but also Upper Egypt. North was downstream, or Lower Egypt, but when it came to death, this orientation changed. Tombs were often placed on the west side of the Nile, because that was where the sun died each day. So while life flowed with the river, death flowed against it. Boats carrying mummies to their tombs would travel against the current, moving southward. And in ritual thinking, this was not resistance. It was return. A soul was returning to the way, source, to the place of beginning, to the sacred waters of origin. Life moved north, but death pulled south. Two movements, two flows, one river. This duality turned the Nile into more than a path. It became a mirror of existence. Farmers saw it as the bringer of floods, the life bringer. Priests saw it as the path between realms. The Nile was not just a body of water. It was a road between worlds, a bridge between gods and men, a current that held past and future in its two opposing hands. The Nile's behavior reinforced this. Each year, it flooded, seemingly reversing the rules of nature. The dry land became water, boundaries vanished, and then, as if remembering itself, the river returned to its banks, leaving behind black silt, renewal, and abundance. Destruction, followed by rebirth. It wasn't just water, it was time, flowing in cycles. This is why so many Egyptian texts describe death not as a descent, but as a voyage. The soul boards the solar boat, sails through the duat, and journeys against the current of mortal time, backward toward divine order. Life flowed downstream toward decay, but the soul sailed upstream toward eternity. Even Ra, the sun god, followed this paradox. During the day, he sailed with the sky, east to west, but at night, through the underworld, he journeyed in the opposite direction, west to east, to rise again. The sun and the river mirrored one another, two currents, two journeys, looping forever. So what does this mean for us? We tend to see time as a straight line, always moving forward. But the Egyptians saw it as a flow with two directions, one for the body, another for the soul. To live was to be carried. To die was to turn, to swim upstream, to return home. The Nile didn't resist this. It allowed both flows. It carried grain to the cities and souls to the tombs. It gave and took, moved forward and back, life and death in harmony. So when you look at a river, ask yourself, are you moving with it or against it? Because in ancient Egypt, to go against the current wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. Time for most of us is something we measure in seconds, hours, days. It passes, it slips away, it limits. But for the ancient Egyptians, time was not simply a tool to measure decay. It was something sacred, something that could be stretched, suspended, or even made immortal. This is the paradox of time that was measured in eternity. A civilization that built calendars and clocks, yet believed that true time, the time of the gods, was not something that passed, but something that remained. A culture where the ticking of time was not a march toward death, but a spiral toward return. The Egyptians had more than one concept of time. Neher represented cyclical time, the turning of days, the flooding of the Nile, the endless rising and setting of the sun. This was the time of seasons, repetition, earthly motion. It was measurable, visible, and mortal. But then there was jet, linear, eternal time, not flowing, but fixed. It wasn't the time that moved, but the time that stood still. The time of stone, of gods, of monuments that would outlast the rise and fall of kingdoms. Jet was not something you experienced. It was something you entered into when you became part of the eternal. Here's the paradox. The Egyptians lived by Neher, but longed for Jet. They farmed with calendars, worshipped in seasons, celebrated festivals of rebirth and return. But their ultimate goal was to escape Neher, to rise beyond the cycle, and join the unchanging realm of eternity. You see this reflected in how they built. Temples were designed to mirror the eternal order. Every block aligned with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, star risings. The temple itself became a calendar in stone, but not a calendar to track time, a calendar to step out of it. Pharaohs prepared for death not as an ending, but as a transition from Neher to Jet. Their tombs were doorways, crafted to allow their soul to move from the world of cycles into the stillness of eternity. Hieroglyphs, rituals, even the design of sarcophagi followed this metaphysical logic. The mortal body died, but the eternal name, the Ren, would remain, etched in Jet. And yet they still measured time. They tracked star movements. They divided day and night into hours. They observed lunar cycles and solar calendars. The very priests who preached eternity were also the scientists of time. This wasn't contradiction. It was harmony. They believed time could be sacred only if it pointed toward the eternal. That every sunrise, every harvest, every festival was not a fleeting moment, but a reflection of an eternal truth. Time, then, was not a countdown. It was a mirror. Even their gods reflected this dual nature. Ra, the sun god, moved in cycles, rising and falling each day. But Atum, the older sun god, represented totality, completion, stillness. Ra was the clock. Atum was the silence that holds the clock in place. So what does this mean for us? We live surrounded by reminders of passing time, schedules, alarms, deadlines. But rarely do we ask, toward what is time moving? What lies beyond the hour, the day, the year? The Egyptians would say, the eternal, not as a metaphor, but as a reality waiting for those who live aligned with cosmic order. And here lies the paradox that haunts. If eternity is real, then the moments we call fleeting may actually be fragments of the infinite. A second of love, a breath of truth, a decision rooted in justice. These are not lost in time. They are absorbed into jet. So the next time you feel time slipping through your fingers, remember the Egyptian vision. Not all time passes. Some of it remains. Because to measure time in minutes is human, but to measure it in meaning, that is divine. Gods are supposed to be eternal, self-sustaining, complete. They create the world. They rule over it. They don't need anything. But in ancient Egypt, that belief is turned inside out. Because in their worldview, some gods didn't just create humans, they depended on them to survive. This is the paradox of the God that needed humans to exist. A divine being, all-powerful in myth and name, whose very presence required human devotion, ritual and memory, or else it faded, diminished, even died. Nowhere is this clearer than in the role of the Egyptian priest. He was not simply a servant of the gods, he was a caretaker. Every day, priests would enter the temple at dawn to awaken the statue of the deity. They would wash it, anoint it, clothe it, feed it symbolic offerings, not out of formality, but because the god required it. Without these daily acts, the god's presence would wither. Ritual was not worship, it was maintenance. This challenges everything we assume about divinity. The god did not sustain the people sustained the god, and yet, the god sustained reality. It was a loop, a divine human circuit of power and dependency. Take Amun-Ra, one of the most powerful gods in Egyptian theology. He was invisible, mysterious, said to dwell in the hidden realm. But despite his cosmic status, his image resided in a dark inner sanctum of the temple where only the highest priests could approach. And each day, he had to be awakened, praised, and cared for. Without this ritual rhythm, Amun's earthly presence faded. The land suffered. The balance of Ma'at, truth, harmony order was disturbed. Human action was required to keep the divine alive. The paradox deepens when you consider the idea of the Ka, the life force. Just as a human needed offerings to sustain their Ka after death, so too did gods. Food was left on altars. Incense was burned. Hymns were sung. These acts were not symbolic gestures, they were fuel. A god could starve from neglect, But how can something eternal need anything? Because in the Egyptian worldview, divinity was relational. Gods were not distant, all-knowing masters. They were participants in creation. The world wasn't a machine. They built and abandoned. It was a living balance that had to be preserved daily by both mortal and immortal hands. And this dependency wasn't seen as weakness. It was seen as truth. Just as the Nile needed rain from lands far away, and crops needed both sun and shadow, so too did the gods need the love, fear, and memory of humankind. Power was not domination. It was exchange. This idea appears most vividly in temple inscriptions. Pharaohs are often depicted offering the Ankh, symbol of life, to the gods themselves. Life flowing upward, from human to divine. A pharaoh didn't simply receive divine authority. He was required to give life back to the gods who gave it to him. It raises an unsettling question. What happens when belief stops? When temples are abandoned? When rituals go silent? When names are no longer spoken? Do the gods disappear? In the Egyptian view, yes. Forgotten gods become inactive. Their presence retreats. Their power dissolves without remembrance. To lose. Memory was to lose reality itself. We see echoes of this in modern times. Legends fade. Sacred names vanish. And with them, once vibrant symbols fall silent. But the Egyptians warned us. What we forget, we weaken. And what we honor, we sustain. So the next time you think of a god, ask, is it watching you? Or are you keeping it alive? Because in ancient Egypt, to believe was not submission. It was creation. And even the gods needed someone to believe in them. We often think of a shadow as something empty, a dark outline that follows us without substance or meaning. But in ancient Egypt, a shadow was not just a trick of light. It was a being, a presence, a part of the soul. And in some cases, it held more power than the body it followed. This is the paradox of the shadow that held power, a form with no mass, no voice, no breath, yet believed to be capable of survival, protection, influence, and danger. A silent twin that witnessed everything and remembered it all. The Egyptian word for shadow was shiut. It was one of the 5 essential parts of a person's soul, alongside the ka, life force, ba, personality, ib, heart, and ren, name. Unlike the ka, which needed offerings, or the ba, which moved freely between worlds, the shut had a strange role. It followed the body in life, lingered after death, and was believed to contain the essence of identity in pure, distilled form. But here's where it becomes strange. The shut could be used. Pharaohs and priests believed that by magically manipulating someone's shadow through ritual, image, or curse, they could influence or destroy that person without touching their body, because the shadow was not an echo, it was a link. And if you could bind the shadow, you could bind the soul. This belief wasn't limited to myth. Shadow rituals were recorded in sacred texts. Figures were drawn with exaggerated shadows. Tomb art showed the deceased's shiut standing beside them, sometimes larger, sometimes darker, as if holding more than just shape. It was both protector and witness. You could run from your enemies, but you could never outrun your shadow. And this led to one of the most unsettling practices, shadow trapping. In certain magical traditions, enemies' shadows were drawn on clay figures or animal hides, then cursed, broken, or buried to symbolically destroy them. The belief was that the physical body might still walk, but the soul's balance would be shattered. The shadow, if corrupted, could drag the rest of the soul with it. But the chute wasn't only a source of danger, it was also a source of protection. Amulets and spells were written specifically to shield one's shadow in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead contains invocations asking gods to protect the chute from harm, to keep it intact so the soul could navigate the underworld safely. Why such care for something we barely notice? Because the Egyptians believed your shadow saw everything. It was always present. It witnessed your life from beginning to end and beyond. In judgment, it could testify. In danger, it could betray you. And if preserved correctly, it could guide you back to your body in the afterlife. It wasn't a metaphor. It was you in silence. Even gods had shadows. Amun's Sheot was said to extend across the earth, influencing kings and priests alike. And some believed that the divine shadow could appear without the god himself, acting as a vessel of presence and power. The god's shadow was enough to command loyalty and fear. So what does that mean for us? We often ignore our shadows, on the wall, on the ground, stretched behind us. But what if those shapes are not meaningless? What if they're ancient witnesses, tracking your path through life like cosmic recordings? What if memory isn't stored in the mind, but in the shade you cast? The Egyptians looked down and saw not emptiness, but evidence. The trace of spirit, always watching, always waiting. So the next time you catch your shadow following behind you, ask yourself, what does it know that you've forgotten? What has it seen that no one else has? Because in ancient Egypt, your shadow wasn't just proof of light. It was proof that something unseen still had power. When we think of a kingdom, we think of land, borders, cities, palaces, armies. But some kingdoms exist without maps. Some empires leave no ruins, no capital, no walls, just myths, whispers, and influence. In ancient Egypt, such a kingdom existed, and it ruled not with armies or taxes, but with belief. This is the paradox of the kingdom that was never found yet ruled all. A realm with no physical capital, no definitive location, but one that shaped religion, law, politics, and the structure of the entire Egyptian cosmos, a kingdom that couldn't be conquered because it was never in one place to begin with. This kingdom was known by many names. Sometimes it was called the Field of Reeds, Aru, the perfect mirror of Egypt in the afterlife. Other times it was the Duat, the underworld, the cosmic realm beneath reality, where souls journeyed after death. And sometimes it was the domain of the primeval mound, the first land to rise from the waters of chaos before time began. But none of these places had coordinates. You couldn't sail to them or walk their streets. Yet every temple, every ritual, every law in Egypt was modeled on these invisible realms. They were considered the blueprints for life on earth. What the gods built in the heavens, the Egyptians tried to build in clay and stone. Pharaohs didn't rule Egypt alone. They ruled in the image of the divine kingdom. Their thrones were replicas of the seats of the gods. Their laws echoed the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic harmony that structured the unseen world. They weren't inventing society. They were imitating a kingdom no one could find. And here lies the paradox. How can you take orders from a place that doesn't exist in space? Because to the Egyptians, existence was not limited to the physical. Something could be realer than real without ever being tangible. These invisible kingdoms were more stable, more eternal than the Nile itself. They were eternal frameworks, and the physical world was merely the reflection, sometimes faithful, often flawed. You see this belief in temple design. Every temple in Egypt followed a pattern based on the mythic temples of the gods. The number of columns, the shape of the courtyards, the progression from light to dark. It was all symbolic of entering another realm. The temple was not just a house for a god. It was a portal to that unseen kingdom. And yet, when archaeologists dig through Egyptian ruins, they never find these kingdoms. No gate to the Duat, no bridge to Aru, no primeval mound preserved in stone. Only the instructions, the imitations, the echo. The true kingdom remains missing, yet its power is undeniable. Even more curiously, many Egyptians hope to return to this invisible kingdom after death, not as visitors, but as citizens. They practiced rituals to prove they had served Ma'at in life. They memorized sacred names. They carried passwords and spells to pass through the gates of the Duat. Not because they were afraid, but because they believed that the real Egypt was not the one they were born into. It was the one beyond the veil. So what does it mean to serve a kingdom that has no land? To obey a throne that no eye can see? It means that power, in its deepest form, isn't always physical. Sometimes, the most enduring empires are those built in belief, myth, and meaning. Egypt's real kingdom was written in the stars, in the alignment of temples, in the rituals performed daily by those who never needed to ask where it was, because they already lived within its shadow. So the next time you wonder what truly rules, a people ask, is it force or is it faith? Because in ancient Egypt, the kingdom that ruled all was never found. It was remembered. We usually think of riddles as puzzles, mental games meant to amuse or challenge. But in ancient Egypt, a riddle could be something far more serious. It wasn't just a test of intelligence. It was a barrier, a guardian, and sometimes the only thing standing between a seeker and a sacred truth. This is the paradox of the riddle that protected the truth. A civilization that believed knowledge was divine, but also dangerous, and that the only way to access it safely was through difficulty, through a question, a maze of meaning, a locked door disguised as a clever phrase. Riddles appear again and again in Egyptian texts, both mythological and magical. Some were embedded in religious hymns. Others were hidden within initiation rites in temples. And many of them weren't written to be answered. They were written to protect, to conceal knowledge from the unworthy, and to slow down those who were too eager to reach the core. Consider the famous Riddle of the Sphinx, later adopted into Greek mythology but rooted in Egyptian belief. A creature asks a question not to entertain, but to determine who may pass. Those who fail don't just lose the game, they lose their lives. This is not metaphor, it is law in a world where knowledge was a sacred flame, never to be given to those who might misuse it. Many Egyptian temples followed this same logic, not just in physical structure, but in ritual progression. A worshipper or initiate could not simply walk in and understand. They had to prove themselves through symbolic acts, cryptic language, complex iconography. The deeper the chamber, the harder the riddle. Only those who understood the hidden logic of the gods could continue inward. And the deeper paradox? Often, the riddles had no answer, or multiple answers, or answers that changed depending on who you were. In some mystery schools, initiates were asked to meditate on contradictory truths. The God lives in silence and in sound. What has never been born but dies every day? The riddle wasn't just a gate. It was a teacher. It forced transformation before revelation. This is where Egyptian wisdom parts ways with modern thinking. Today, we seek clarity. We want straightforward answers. But the Egyptians believed that truth was sacred because it was hard to reach. If it could be spoken easily, it was probably not divine. They feared not ignorance, but unearned knowledge. That's why so many sacred texts were written in layered meanings. A story about a god was never just a story. It was also an astronomical key, a metaphysical principle, a political warning. Only those who knew how to read between the lines could unlock the actual teaching. It's also why names were kept hidden. A god's true name was a riddle. To know it was to hold power over that being. Isis once tricked Ra into revealing his secret name, and by doing so, she gained his authority. A single word, once understood, became a key to divinity. But only if you solve the riddle to find it. So what does this mean for us? We live in an age obsessed with answers. But maybe the Egyptians were right to fear simple truths. Maybe the question itself is the sacred thing. Because only when you are willing to wrestle with a riddle, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, do you become ready for the truth it hides. So ask yourself, what truths in your life are guarded by questions you've avoided? And which riddles, if you dared to solve them, would change you forever? Because in ancient Egypt, wisdom didn't arrive easily. It came wrapped in shadows, in metaphor, in paradox. And the truth, it never stood alone. It was always hidden behind a riddle. Walls are meant to divide, to protect, to enclose, to keep things in or out. But in ancient Egypt, some walls were not barriers. They were listeners, silent, unmoving, and made of stone, yet believed to record what was said and to remember, long after the speaker was gone. This is the paradox of the wall that heard secrets. A structure built from lifeless material, yet treated as a conscious presence, one that bore witness, absorbed confession, and could one day testify. In Egyptian tombs and temples, walls were covered with inscriptions, names, prayers, declarations, invocations, spells. These weren't mere decorations. Every symbol, every stroke of a hieroglyph was thought to carry sound. The Egyptians believed writing was a form of spoken magic, and stone, though mute, could still hear. When you spoke inside a tomb, whether in grief, praise, or ritual, the words were believed to be captured by the walls. The soul of the deceased, resting nearby, could hear them through the stone. And if no one spoke, the carvings themselves spoke for you. The texts on the walls were designed to recite spells continuously, as long as they existed. If no priest came to perform the rite, the wall would remember. This belief extended beyond tombs. In temples, certain chambers were known as whispering rooms. Their acoustics were intentionally designed to amplify even the quietest sound. A word spoken in one corner would travel through the air and echo back, as if the God within had heard and responded. These walls weren't passive, they communicated. But what's more haunting is the idea that some walls were meant to keep secrets, not reveal them. In some mystery cults, priests whispered sacred names and confessions to the walls of inner sanctuaries, words never written down. The belief was that the wall would hold the secret, preserving it for eternity, but never betraying it. And here lies the paradox. A wall made of stone, incapable of movement or will, becomes both a record and a refuge. It holds the sacred without sharing it. It absorbs sound but doesn't echo it without purpose. It becomes the perfect witness, eternal, neutral, incorruptible. This turns Egyptian architecture into something terrifyingly intimate. Every word you said in a sacred space stayed there. Every vow, every lie, every whispered fear. You didn't need to shout for the gods to hear you. You only needed to be near the wall. The ancient Egyptians treated their structures accordingly. They cleansed the walls with incense. They sang hymns to activate inscriptions. In some cases, they even fed the walls, offering food and libations to the very stones, as if nourishing the memory within them. And when a temple was desecrated, when names were chiseled out, or curses scratched into sacred murals, it wasn't just vandalism, it was spiritual violence. An attempt to erase the memory of the wall, to silence what it had heard. Because if the wall no longer remembered, it could no longer protect, or testify, or speak for the dead. This idea resonates even today. Think of all the places we speak in confidence: bedroom walls, hospital rooms, confession booths. What if they remember? What if memory is not only biological, but environmental? The Egyptians would say, it is. So the next time you stand before an ancient wall, or any wall, pause. Ask yourself, what has this wall heard? What has it stored that no one else remembers? Because in ancient Egypt, stone was never just stone. It was a witness. And sometimes, the only one who truly knew what happened was the wall itself. In our world, symbols are shorthand, letters, logos, signs that represent things. But in ancient Egypt, symbols were not representations. They were forces, sacred tools, living entities. And in some cases, they weren't used to describe reality, they were used to create it. This is the paradox of the symbol that carved the world. A mark made by human hands, drawn in ink or chiseled into stone, that was believed to shape the very fabric of existence. A glyph that didn't just mean something, it did something. A visual form that became a spiritual function. Central to this paradox are the hieroglyphs. Each one was more than a letter or picture. It was a being. A bird wasn't just a bird. The image of the falcon represented Horus, the sky god. A coiled snake could be a sound, a word, or a spiritual presence. When these signs were arranged in sacred texts, they weren't just read, they were activated. Egyptians believed that to write a thing was to manifest it. That's why names were so sacred. To write a god's name was to summon a fragment of that god's power. To write a curse was to send a force into the world. And to erase a name was to destroy its essence. This belief shaped their architecture, religion, and ritual. Temples were covered in symbols from foundation to rooftop, not for decoration, but for function. Each glyph reinforced divine order. Each wall became a working part of the cosmos. The temple itself wasn't just built, it was spelled into being. You see this most vividly in the creation myths. In one version, the god Ptah didn't mold the world with his hands. He thought of it in his heart and spoke its name into being. The word, the sound, the symbol, it carved reality. And because he named it, it was. Creation, in this sense, was an act of linguistic magic. And here the paradox becomes almost dizzying. Humans, by learning and writing these symbols, were not just recording truth, they were participating in creation. The scribe wasn't a passive observer. He was a magician, a co-creator, a guardian of cosmic equilibrium. Ink became influence. Symbols became substance. But this power came with danger. Certain symbols, especially those depicting animals like snakes or scorpions, were considered too powerful to leave whole. Artists would intentionally break the glyphs when not used ritually to prevent them from becoming animated. A drawn cobra could bite. A carved jackal could wander. A word could live. It wasn't superstition. It was metaphysical caution. Some of the most secretive priesthoods guarded symbolic sequences, phrases and arrangements believed to open portals, summon deities, or alter spiritual reality. These weren't shared lightly. To misuse a symbol was to break the world's balance. And yet, paradoxically, the more a symbol was used, the more powerful it became. A single glyph, written over and over in temple walls, tombs and scrolls accumulated. Spiritual mass. It gained memory. It became heavy with meaning. Some believed the gods watched through their symbols, that their eyes weren't only in heaven, but inside the walls. Even death didn't stop the influence. Tombs were packed with symbolic carvings to ensure the deceased would find their way through the underworld. If the symbols were wrong or incomplete, the soul could be lost forever. So what does this mean for us? We live in a world flooded with symbols, emojis, flags, brands, signs, but we rarely believe they do anything. The Egyptians would disagree. They would say every mark carries intention, power, consequence. That writing is an act of creation, and reading is a form of transformation. So the next time you write your name, draw a shape, or carve something into permanence, ask yourself, is this just a message? Or are you building something? Because in ancient Egypt, a symbol wasn't passive, it was active, and some symbols didn't reflect the world. They carved it into being. Time devours everything. Cities fall, statues erode, empires collapse. Even the greatest works of stone are eventually reduced to dust. And yet in Egypt, there are temples that have defied this rule. They stand, silent, weathered, battered, by centuries, but somehow intact. Not untouched, but unbroken. This is the paradox of the temple that refused to crumble. A structure built in a world of impermanence that behaves as though it were immune to time itself. A place where belief was carved so deeply into the walls that even time seems afraid to erase it. Take Abydos, the ancient temple complex dedicated to Osiris. Its columns still rise from the ground. Its hieroglyphs remain crisp. Even after thousands of years, the carvings whisper stories as if they were made yesterday. Or Karnak, the largest religious structure ever built by humans, a temple so vast that each pharaoh added to it, not to replace what came before, but to extend it into eternity. Karnak didn't just resist ruin, it grew. Why? Not because the stone was stronger. Not because the craftsmanship was better, but because the Egyptians didn't build temples to last for centuries. They built them to last for eternity. Every measurement, every alignment, every ritual was designed to anchor the building to divine order, to the principles of Ma'at, the cosmic harmony that structured both the heavens and the earth. The paradox deepens when we look at their architectural logic. Temples were not designed for practicality. They were machines for immortality. Each corridor, chamber, and pylon followed sacred geometry. Rooms got darker and narrower as one moved inward, symbolizing a descent into the hidden truths of the cosmos. The innermost sanctum wasn't just a storage room. It was the center of the universe, where the god statue lived, and where the eternal breathed through stone. Egyptians believed that as long as ritual continued, the temple would remain spiritually alive. And even when ritual stopped, they believed the stone would hold the memory. The temple would still remember its purpose, like a sleeper in a deep dream, waiting to be awakened. But what happens when no one is left to remember? Here's where the paradox sharpens. Some temples were buried by sand for centuries, completely hidden, like Dendera or Philae. But when uncovered, they appeared preserved by silence, as if the earth itself had protected them from decay, as if their refusal to crumble was an act of will, not physics, and modern science has confirmed the mystery. Some temples exhibit resistance to erosion far beyond expectation. Their orientation deflects harsh wind. Their foundations adapt to ground shifts. Their internal structures maintain balance despite massive weight. It's as though the builders knew something, not just about engineering, but about time. The Egyptians believed that time had layers. Nehe was cyclical time, sunrise, sunset, flood, and drought. But Jet was eternal time, unchanging, unmoving, divine. Temples, they believed, were planted in Jet. While the world moved around them, they stayed anchored to a reality that did not decay. This gives rise to an eerie idea that these temples still function, that despite the tourists, the broken altars, the missing priests, the sacred pulse still echoes in the stone. That what was once divine still is. So what does this mean for us? We live in an era of planned obsolescence. We build for decades, not millennia. But the Egyptians asked, what survives the fall of memory? And their answer was clear. Belief, carved into stone. Ritual, locked into architecture. Purpose, sealed into silence. So the next time you stand before ruins that refuse to collapse, ask, is this just good stonework? Or did someone build it with eternity in mind? Because in ancient Egypt, a temple wasn't a structure. It was a statement, and some of them still refuse to fall silent. We tend to think of legacy as something fixed, an inheritance from the past, carved in truth, preserved across generations. But in ancient Egypt, legacy was not a passive artifact. It was a force, and sometimes it reached backward in time to reshape its own beginning. This is the paradox of the legacy that rewrote its origins. A civilization where memory was not only preserved, but revised, where history bent under the weight of future belief, and where those who came later had the power to alter the meaning of those who came before. In a land obsessed with continuity, Egyptians were masters of intentional forgetting. When a pharaoh fell out of favor, his name was erased from walls, Statues were smashed, inscriptions defaced. This wasn't just political, it was metaphysical. To remove a name was to undo a soul's afterlife. The person was not only dishonored, they were unmade. But here's where the paradox intensifies. Just as a legacy could be erased, it could also be invented. Pharaohs would claim lineage from gods who had no children. Kings would retroactively insert themselves into sacred myths. Temples were built by new rulers, then inscribed with the names of older ones, as if to say, we were always part of this. Time, in Egypt, wasn't linear. It was editable. One of the most extreme examples is Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled as a king. She commissioned massive temples and had herself portrayed as male in statues. Beard, broad shoulders, kingly attire. But after her death, her stepson Thutmose III attempted to erase her from history. Her cartouches were chiseled off, her achievements attributed to others. And for centuries, it worked. Her story disappeared, until archaeology revived it. And then there's Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who introduced monotheism to Egypt. He declared the sun disk, Aten, the only god. He rewrote religious texts, closed temples, and moved the capital to a new city. But after his death, his successors tried to wipe him from existence. His legacy was buried, literally, and for thousands of years, we knew almost nothing of him. But now, ironically, he's one of the most studied figures in Egyptian history. His erased legacy became louder than ever. So the paradox stands, a legacy powerful enough to rewrite its origin, by force, by faith, or by forgetting. But this wasn't deception to the Egyptians, it was survival. They believed that history was not just a record, but a tool, a living substance. To shape memory was to shape reality, and this shaped how they lived. Every monument was carved with the awareness that future generations might edit it, that one's name might rise in glory or vanish into dust. Even the gods weren't immune. As dynasties changed, so did the roles of deities. Amun merged with Ra. Seth, once a protector, became a villain. Osiris grew from a funerary god into a symbol of universal resurrection. The divine story kept evolving, rewriting its own beginning to suit the present. So what does this mean for us? We like to believe history is solid, but perhaps it's more fluid than we'd like to admit. Perhaps our stories, our legacies, aren't just written by what we do, but by who chooses to remember us, and how. In Egypt, to be remembered was everything, but to be remembered correctly was rare. So the next time you think of your own legacy, ask, is it something you leave behind? Or something someone else might use to rewrite the past? Because in ancient Egypt, history was not just what happened, it was what endured. And sometimes the final word came first. What survives of Egypt is not just stone and sand, but paradox. A civilization obsessed with death that celebrated life. Gods who needed humans to exist. Statues that dreamed. Temples that refused to fall. Rivers that flowed against time. Each paradox we explored wasn't just an oddity of belief. It was a mirror held up to the human condition. The ancient Egyptians didn't divide science from spirit, myth from memory, or life from the afterlife. To them, reality was layered. What was visible was never the whole truth. A symbol could hold power. A name could shape destiny. A wall could remember your voice long after you were gone. They didn't just live inside history. They curated it. cutting, rewriting, erasing, and exalting until it formed something sacred. And in doing so, they left us something few cultures ever have, a blueprint for thinking beyond the linear. They showed us that the most powerful truths aren't always logical. They're resonant. That memory can outlast marble. That silence can be louder than words. So as you step away from these paradoxes, consider this. Perhaps the greatest mystery. Egypt left behind is not buried in tombs or etched in stone, but in the questions we're still asking, the echoes we still hear, and the parts of ourselves we still don't understand.